Lives versus profits. What should really be driving your business? In the theory and case that follow, we will be forced to rethink the social responsibility of a business. Hello, I'm Misty Corella, and today I will be taking you through the theory portion of this presentation. In The Collapse and Transformation of Our World by Duncan Taylor and Graeme Taylor, our author's approach is more of a big picture approach versus an individual business approach. So please keep that in mind when following along. The first line of the theory says, terrorism will not destroy global civilization. Our civilization will destroy itself. And what the authors discuss in the introduction is that industrial civilization will soon collapse because of a fatal flaw. It is designed to grow constantly within a finite planet. Which means that we are consuming the biophysical foundations of our civilization. World population has increased from 800 million in 1750 to 6.5 billion in 2006. We shifted from the agrarian culture, which is an early farming society, to the current global industrial age. Natural resources are declining and disappearing, some of which by global warming, according to our authors. And consumer culture and globalization has allowed society to expand past sustainable limits. As you can see by the differences in Diagram 1 and Diagram 2, our resource footprint of global population in 2006 is 25% larger than the annual natural income, which means we are unsustainable. Our health and survival is dependent on the health and survival of the complex ecosystems that support life on Earth. If we don't make a structural change, we will collapse by 2050. And this is something that the authors emphasized. So what can we do? Well, our authors pose 3 questions. Why is global industrial civilization unsustainable? What are the requirements for a sustainable civilization? And what can we do to help a sustainable global civilization evolve out of the coming collapse of our social and natural worlds? Before we move on, please go to the discussion board and list some of the reasons why you think our civilization is unsustainable and what you would do to change it. Or maybe you think it is sustainable. Just let us know your thoughts. So why is global industrial civilization unsustainable? The first is because social systems are dependent on biophysical systems. And what they mean is industrial economies are unsustainable because they are based on a mechanistic or physical worldview, focusing on individual gains instead of interrelated systems, meaning they're not taking into account environmental costs when installing a new factory. Industrial economies are unsustainable because they are based on a continuous material growth, and continuous material growth involves the constant degradation of biophysical systems. And lastly, industrial economies are unsustainable because they are based on a consumer culture. Consumer culture creates false needs for power, status, and wealth instead of satisfying real needs for community, meaning, or survival. The second reason why global industrial civilization is unsustainable is because technological solutions cannot fix social problems. Technology will reduce the rate of destruction growth, but in order to be sustainable, the process of destruction needs to be reversed and the environment needs to be restored, which is the reduction of consumption, which will be shown on diagrams 4 and 5 in the following slide. And resources need to be redistributed, and the disparities between rich and poor need to be greatly reduced, the redistribution of wealth. And the last point that our authors say, our sustainable global civilization cannot be made sustainable. We have the available material resources and the scientific knowledge, but the will or desire to change has not. Companies have implemented policies designed to sustain growth, which is a quantitative expansion, rather than develop sustainability, a qualitative transformation. And the last point, a consumer society cannot be transformed into a conservative society without structural change. As you can see in diagram 4, human economies will only survive over the long term if they're able to function within the carrying capacity of the planet. The resources of 4 more planets would be needed for everyone in the world to live like Americans. The average footprint of the U.S. citizen is significantly larger than the fair Earth share in 2003. In the diagram 5, the global per capita footprint needs to be reduced now if human economies are to be sustainable. A 43% reduction from 2003 is needed by 2050. Again, there's that time frame of 2050. Now that we've discussed why global industrial civilization is unsustainable, what are the requirements for a sustainable civilization? According to the author, the number one thing is to satisfy humanity's needs. In addition to simply material needs such as food, shelter, and safety, there are also needs for health and wholeness, for meaning and belonging, identity, for relationship to one's community and biophysical context, for physical, social, emotional, mental, and spiritual needs. To be able to facilitate cooperation, equality, justice, and peaceful conflict resolution. These goals will only be met by also meeting the needs of the planet's biophysical systems and protecting its millions of life forms. The goal is to eliminate war and preserve the environment. In addition to satisfying humanity's needs, you also need to value interdependence and diversity. In plants, resources, and culture, diversity increases a system's resilience. Viable societies will also require more efficient and less bureaucratic social structures. Sustainable societies must be decentralized and self-regulating, a shift from partial democracy to participatory democracy. And sustainable societies require integral worldviews. So now that we've discussed why a civilization is unsustainable, and what the requirements are for a sustainable civilization, what can we do to help a sustainable global civilization evolve out of the coming collapse of our social and natural world? Well, according to the author, we need to implement the BEST model, which is the Biosocial Evolutionary Systems Theory, which you can see in the diagram to the right. As we are entering the bifurcation point, or the crisis point, according to our author, there are only 3 possibilities for the future of our civilization. The first one is that cascading environmental crises will rapidly escalate, producing uncontrolled economic, social, and political crises, causing irreversible damage, meaning global civilization will disintegrate. It'll go from point 1, 2, right to 6 and 7. The second possibility is that political and business leaders will proactively respond, introducing new technologies and sustainable development, but it's still not enough without changing the whole structure. Resources will decline and civilization will collapse. It will get to point 1, 2, 3, but then go to 6 and 7. And the last possibility is that sustainable solutions are supported and constructive reorganization begins. Should this happen, the collapse of the contemporary civilization will become a springboard for evolution of a sustainable civilization. The reorganization of the global system will accelerate, and you will have integration, and the BEST model will be successful. So now that we have hit part 4 and part 5 on the BEST model, what can we do to help a sustainable global civilization evolve out of the coming collapse? According to the authors, there are 3 things. The first is the emergence of an integral worldview, and this is critical for creating sustainable society. There needs to be a shift in our cultural patterns. If you look at diagram 7, our society needs to change from an industrial age to an information age. Our religion and worldviews need to change. Our culture and aesthetics, our government, our education, our family, social organizations, our economy, and our science and technology sections. Secondly, we need to maximize cooperation around common interest while minimizing competition over scarce resources and differing values. Include but still transcend the old structures. And the last thing that we can do to create a sustainable civilization is to organize for change. Our authors suggest implementing an international agreement that follows the 6 points. Limiting growth, meaning because our planet has finite resources, there are limits to growth. If the global economy continues to exceed sustainability limits, it will destroy its biophysical foundations and collapse. 2, our collective survival depends on human economies becoming sustainable. 3, essential human and biophysical needs must be met in order for human economies to be sustainable. 4, resources must be redistributed to meet essential human and biophysical needs. 5, cultural and genetic diversity is essential for health and wholeness. And 6, in order for different cultures and societal systems to coexist, their values and structures must promote peaceful cooperation and sustainability. If you take a look at the diagram, this is a great example of what our authors envision for a sustainable planetary civilization. This concludes the theory portion of the presentation. Before we transition to the case, please let us know in the discussion board any thoughts you would like to share about this big picture theory on sustainability. We will also go over more in-depth discussions in the evaluation section later on.
Hello, my name is Angela, and I'll be presenting our GSK case study. Sustainability is a universally recognizable theme. Most people equate it with environmental sustainability, which is what our theory applies it to. But it also applies to individual decisions and even business practices. This case deals with the practices of GlaxoSmithKline and their dealings with AIDS victims in poor countries, specifically South Africa. AIDS is a disease spread through the exchange of bodily fluids. This can be through sexual contact, blood transfusions, contaminated needles, and during birth from mother to infant. Once contracted, HIV spreads through the body, attacking its immune system and preventing it from being able to fight off normally simple illnesses. Beginning in 1980 in the United States, more than 200,000 people fell victim to the disease within the first 10 years of its emergence. With no effective treatment available at the time, most people died once infected. By 1987, more than 127 countries had reported cases of HIV. The disease saw its decline in the United States during the 90s, with reported cases dropping from 80,000 people in 1993 to only 21,700 7 years later in 2000. While the United States was enjoying remission, the rest of the world was experiencing catastrophe on a global scale. 40 million people were infected with HIV/AIDS, while 20 million people had died from the disease. Africa alone had harbored 25 million infected individuals. In the year 2000, South Africa had the highest concentration of HIV-positive individuals in the world. With more than 5 million people suffering, it was predicted by healthcare officials that by 2010, that number would grow to more than 7.5 million people. Conditions in Africa lent themselves to rapid spread, and it was estimated that by 2015, more than 30% of children in Africa would be orphaned by HIV/AIDS. In 1998, the average income in Africa rested around $2,000, with a year of HIV/AIDS treatment costing about $14,000. The stark contrast between income and expense meant that an HIV/AIDS diagnosis was almost always a death sentence. The lack of affordability, coupled with the unsatisfactory living conditions, gave way to an epidemic of HIV/AIDS-related death, and even though the medication existed to treat the disease, it remained out of reach for most of the population of South Africa. In an effort to help their people, South African politicians launched a policy that allowed them to waive the intellectual rights of pharmaceutical companies and offered generic versions of medicine for cheaper and more affordable options. Waiving the intellectual property rights of the pharmaceutical companies meant that generic versions were available for about 2% of the patented price. Pharmaceutical companies lashed out at the South African government, levying a lawsuit where they claimed their rights were being violated by the South African government. GlaxoSmithKline, GSK, the leading producer for AIDS medication, launched into a campaign to retain their pricing in South Africa and other poor countries like it. GSK argued their pricing was fair and necessary in order to make up for the high cost of research and development of new drugs, including AIDS medications. GSK claimed lowering prices in South Africa would limit their ability to charge fair prices elsewhere. GSK argued while they were already doing their best to aid the suffering people of poor nations like South Africa. Despite global patent protection policy, there was a huge public backlash. GSK and other pharmaceutical companies were targeted by nonprofits and patient rights groups. The nonprofits argued that GSK and others like it were nothing but greedy and pointed to the low costs of production, claiming they were taking advantage of the plights of the people, preying on humans for profit. The image of big pharmaceutical companies ignoring the plights of dying South Africans was too disturbing for the public, and despite numerous attempts to save their public image, GSK was seen as the bad guy. GSK and their compatriots had billion-dollar profit margins, and in the public eye, that money was made on the backs of sickly, dying, and defenseless citizens of third-world countries. GSK continued to point to their philanthropies, medical aid to sub-Saharan countries, price reductions for nonprofits, and eventually they even cut their prices by over 93%. However, it was way too little, way too late for GSK. Millions of Africans had died due to the unavailability of medication, and the public placed the blame solely on the back of GSK and other pharmaceutical companies. The blame game continued, and millions of South Africans are still waiting for access to life-saving medication.
In our case study of the GlaxoSmithKline Pharmaceutical Company and their AIDS treatment, HAART, we see a very clear example of corporate interests outweighing human interests to maintain profits. Hello everyone, my name is James Marks and I'm going to talk with you about the correlations between the GlaxoSmithKline case study and the theory BEST. The pressure came from charitable and humanitarian agencies such as Oxfam, Médecins Sans Frontières, and ACT UP. These agencies, acting on behalf of humanity's needs, changed corporate behavior. This is exactly the type of change that the theory has outlined, a cultural and ideological shift that prioritizes human needs over that of corporate needs. The theory's idea of rapid, sometimes violent change not necessarily yielding violent outcomes is also demonstrated here. Cooperation and common interests in this case were actualized and maximized, while competition was minimized once appropriate pressure was applied. Taking it a step further and zooming out a bit, practitioners of the BEST theory are tasked with doing more than prioritizing human interests over corporate. The theory provides a rubric for how to prioritize in order to live sustainably and calls on everyone to take that action. The biosocial evolutionary systems theory, or BEST, has many strengths and weaknesses that must be overcome to function as intended. Some of its many strengths include the most fundamental ideology that human needs and interests are greater than that of corporate needs. Every good theory needs to offer up a corollary, a new proposition. This theory recommends a global agreement that contains several specific provisions. While we agree that having a recommendation is a strength, the quality of the recommendation leaves something to be desired. I'll come back to that in a moment. Best requires interdependence, diversity, efficiency, and reductions to bureaucracy, which many agree are beneficial. Best also has several weaknesses. For starters, the theory is very polarizing and hard-lined. The authors seemingly issue their edict and demand compliance. The only alternative they leave you with is certain destruction within the current generation. Secondly, the time it would take to implement a global agreement of the magnitude described in their model is far greater than the time the author says we have before the issue of environmental collapse would be irreversible. It is important to note, however, that this theory is over 10 years old and that the Paris Agreement was put in place in 2016. This agreement between nations is a very public and controversial topic, particularly in the United States, now that we have withdrawn from this agreement. Who thinks the two are related? Drop a note on the discussion board and let us know what you think. Thirdly, the clauses outlined in the agreements and tenets were unrealistic and likely unattainable. The theory assumes a finite resource pool, what it calls a biophysical footprint. This assumption may be true today, but technology, agriculture, and other economies could change the size of this footprint. Advances in technology, for example, can allow us to use more fuel more efficiently or tap a new fuel source. Advances in farming have made it possible for chicken, beef, pork, and many other types of meat to be readily available in almost every home in the U.S. Please take a moment and head over to the discussion board. In your opinion, what are some of the theory's strengths? Its weaknesses? How might it be improved? Do you agree with the assertions stated here? In general, the theory is not bad at its core. It strives for sustainability, acknowledging it, and prioritizing for the things that are really important. The theory could be improved by having more flexibility and leniency in the agreement the authors proposed. Taking a hard line and accepting no quarter is not a negotiating tactic and will end up with everyone walking away from the table before negotiations even begin. The theory needs to acknowledge the role technology and industry have to play. Both can delay or potentially resolve some of the issues that are outlined in this theory. Finally, and most importantly, offer up stopgap or one-time windfall recommendations. These recommendations could buy time until a global agreement can be reached and implemented. In our case study, GlaxoSmithKline was pressured into dropping prices in developing countries by pending lawsuits and continued attacks on their reputation and brand. In general, over the last decade, humanitarian agencies have added many tools to their toolbox, and their tactics are working, as demonstrated in our case study. The needle is moving. A cultural and ideological shift is happening. Change can be rapid and violent, but the outcomes don't have to be, just so long as everyone prepares for it. Through maximizing cooperative efforts and minimizing competition when it's appropriate, we can succeed. It's important to note here that we do not believe that all competition is bad. Most of our lives and our progress's causality is traced to competition, but competition must also be weighed as a strategy. Is it beneficial to be competitive when it does not support sustainability? In this specific case, no. In other cases, maybe, or probably. I leave you with this last point. All changes must include sustainability, and to be sustainable, we may need to change. We all need sustainability. Some type of homeostatic baseline that allows us to continue on. Whether we are applying this theory to an international agreement, to business strategy, or to our personal lives. We must ensure that our priorities are really our true priorities, and that they are sustainable. Making short-term gains right now at the cost of the future is not a gain. It is a loss. Thanks for your time, and don't forget to head over to the discussion board and give us your thoughts.